Hello. Hope you've had a good week while we've been separate. I'm going to read you a Shakespeare story this week again. I haven't had one for a couple of weeks, so I'm going to read you one today. This one is called Much Ado About Nothing. Well, work it out for yourselves why it's called that. First of all, as usual, we're going to meet the characters. We have Dom Pedro, who is the Prince of Aragon. We have Claudio, who is a companion to Dom Pedro. We have Benedict, who is another companion of Dom Pedro. We have Leonardo, who's the governor of Messina, which is a place in Italy. And then we have Hera, Leonardo's daughter, and Beatrice, Leonardo's niece. And the scene is in Sicily, in the Mediterranean, and the island with a volcano, Mount Etna, which has been erupting lately. And it's set in the 16th century. I suppose that's the ideal time, seeing as how that was when Shakespeare was living. So, this might give you a clue as to what the theme of the story is. Sigh no more, ladies, sigh no more. Men were deceivers ever. 1 foot in sea, and 1 foot on the shore. To one thing, constant? Never. Much ado about nothing. In the house of Leonardo, governor of Messina, all was fuss and flutter. The governor's old friend, Dom Pedro, Prince of Aragon, and several of his captains had stayed at the house some months earlier on their way to war. With the war safely won, the prince had decided to visit again on his return. Shortly before Dom Pedro's arrival, 2 lovely young women hurried down to the main courtyard of the governor's house. One was Hero, Leonardo's only child. The other was her cousin Beatrice. Though the 2 were closer than sisters, they had little in common. Dark-haired Hero's innocent blue eyes matched her mild-mannered sweetness. Beatrice had fair hair, a sharp mind, and an even sharper tongue. Lord Claudio fought well by all accounts, Beatrice remarked to her cousin as they descended a staircase. You took quite a fancy to him last time he was here, didn't you? Just as you took a fancy to Lord Benedict, said Hero, blushing. Beatrice rolled her eyes. Benedict is the most irritating man I've ever met. Why? Said Hero. Because he's as witty as you are? Because he thinks he's as witty as me, growled Beatrice. If he lived off his wit, he'd die of starvation. Hero and Beatrice reached the courtyard and stood beside Leonardo, just as the prince's party rode in through the gates and dismounted. Dom Pedro was flanked by Claudio, whose brown curls glowed in the sunlight, and Benedict, whose mouth wore its customary cynical smile. Behind them came Don John, the prince's half-brother, with his servant Borachio. After embracing Leonato, Don Pedro stared in wonder at Hero. "You've grown so tall while I've been away," he exclaimed. Hero, who was gazing at Claudio, who was gazing back at her, made no reply. "Or have we grown shorter, my lord?" quipped Benedick. "Perhaps the heavy armour we've been wearing has squashed us." "Why are you prattling on, Benedick? No one's listening," Beatrice said sharply. Benedick mocked her with a bow. "Ah, Lady Beatrice, as scornful as ever." "That's hardly surprising," Beatrice said. "When I'm with you, I see so much to be scornful of." And she turned away to follow Dom Pedro and her uncle into the house. Benedick nudged Claudio in the ribs. "Pity the man who marries her, Claudio," he chuckled. "Claudio! Claudio!" Claudio was glassy-eyed. "Did you see Hero?" he murmured. "Yes, pretty girl. Not as pretty as her cousin, but Hero is the most wonderful person in the world," Claudio sighed. Benedick peered closely at his friend. "You haven't fallen in love with her, have you?" "Head over heels," Claudio said. "You'll be telling me next you want to marry her." "If I don't, I'll never be happy again," said Claudio gloomily. Dom Pedro appeared at the door. "What's keeping you both?" he inquired. "Claudio's in love with Hero and wants to marry her," declared Benedick. "My lord, the day you hear that I wish to marry, set me up as a target and shoot me with arrows," said Benedick. "Is this true, Claudio?" the prince said. "Yes," said Claudio. "I didn't notice Hero before because I could think only of the war. But now I've seen her beauty, I can't live without her. What shall I do, my lord?" Dom Pedro placed a hand on Claudio's shoulder. "Leave this to me," he said. "Leonato is holding a masked ball tonight. I'll dance with Hero and explain your feelings for her. If she feels the same, I'll ask Leonato for her hand on your behalf." Claudio beamed. Benedick muttered under his breath. That night, the ballroom of the governor's house swirled with music and dancers. Claudio stood on tiptoe and peered anxiously at Dom Pedro and Hero as they swept across the dance floor. On the opposite side of the room, Benedick, in a hair mask, in other words, he was dressed up to look like a hare, a rabbit, was in conversation with Beatrice, whose mask resembled an owl's face. Benedick had adopted a strange accent to conceal his identity. Beatrice knew perfectly well who he was, but pretended that she didn't. "Won't you tell me your name, stranger?" she pleaded. "Pardon me, but no," said Benedick. "You're as provoking as Lord Benedick," grumbled Beatrice. "Lord Benedick?" Benedick said. "Who is he?" "He's the prince's jester, and the dullest of fools," said Beatrice. "People laugh more behind his back than they do at his jokes." "If I meet him, I'll tell him you said so," Benedict said. "Please do," said Beatrice, slipping away between the dancing couples. Benedict was stung. So that's her opinion of me," he thought. "A jester and a dull fool." He frowned, puzzled. "But why should I care what Beatrice thinks of me?" he asked himself. "We can't stand each other, can we?" Meanwhile, Dom Pedro presented Hero to Claudio, while Leonato looked on in smiling approval. "The lady is wooed and won," said the prince. "You will be married in the family chapel the day after tomorrow," Leonato declared. These words were caught by a man wearing a fox's head mask. "My master ought to know of this," thought the man, threading through the throng. He was Don John's servant, Borachio. As Dom Pedro raised a goblet of wine to toast Hero and Claudio, Benedict chanced by. He had removed his mask to reveal a very glum face. "Celebrate with us, Benedict," Dom Pedro urged. "Forgive me, my lord, but I'm not in the mood," said Benedict. "I'm escaping from Lady Beatrice. I've had enough of her for one night." Dom Pedro smiled at Benedict's departing back. "What a couple Benedict and Beatrice would make," he said. Leonato guffawed. "Had inside a week." "I suspect that they're fonder of each other than they realize," said Dom Pedro. "If we convinced Benedict that Beatrice was in love with him, and Beatrice that Benedict loved her, nature would do the rest." "But how could we convince them, my lord?" asked Claudio. Dom Pedro lowered his voice, and the others huddled round like conspirators. Borachio discovered Don John skulking in his room. "You should have come to the ball, my lord," Borachio said. Don John scowled. "Watching the prince being flattered would have sickened me. Because our father married his mother and not mine, he rules while I serve. I daren't challenge him, but if I could find a way to hurt him and his fawning friends—" "I may know a way, my lord," Borachio smirked. "I've learned that Lady Hero is to marry Lord Claudio. I've also learned that Lady Hero's chambermaid, Margaret, is sweet on me, and that's given me an idea." "What idea?" asked Don John. Borachio answered at length, and what he said brought a cruel smile to his master's lips. Next morning, Benedict strolled through the governor's gardens, deep in thought. "Why does love turn people into fools?" he wondered. A few days ago, Claudio was a courageous soldier. Now he's a drooling lapdog. It will take a special kind of woman to win my love. beautiful, wise, witty, well-to-do. Where will I find someone like that? Benedict followed a path between two hedges, and from the opposite side of the hedge to his left, he heard Don Pedro chatting with Leonato and Claudio. The subject of their conversation stopped Benedict in his tracks, but the hedge prevented him from seeing the twinkles in the men's eyes as they spoke. "So your niece Beatrice loves Benedict, Leonato," said Don Pedro. "To distraction, my lord," Leonato replied. "It's pitiful to hear her at night, whispering his name and weeping." "But she behaves as if she detests Benedict," said Claudio. "Pretence, all pretence," Leonato assured him. "She knows that if Benedict finds out that she loves him, he'll mock her for it. To avoid the humiliation, she keeps her breaking heart hidden." "Should I talk to Benedict and tell him to be gentle with her?" inquired Don Pedro. "I don't know what to do for the best, my lord," Leonato confided. "I'm afraid that Beatrice's passion for Benedict will drive her out of her wits." The three men sighed heavily. "Let's go inside," said Don Pedro. "A good idea might come to us over dinner." For several minutes Benedict paced up and down, chin in hand, while his mind churned. "Beatrice loves me?" he thought. "Poor girl! I can't stand by and watch her suffer. She must be rescued, and the only rescue is for me to woo her." "Benedict!" said a voice. Benedict looked round and saw Beatrice behind him. He searched her face for signs of secret love. "The prince sent me to ask you in to dinner," Beatrice said. "It wasn't my idea. I don't care whether you have dinner or go without." "Thank you for taking the trouble to find me," said Benedict. "If it had been any trouble, I wouldn't have bothered," Beatrice snapped. She turned on her heel and flounced off. "If it had been any trouble, I wouldn't have bothered," Benedict repeated softly. "There's a hidden meaning in those words, somewhere. She loves me sure as can be." It didn't occur to him to wonder why he felt so delighted about that. On her way back to the house, Beatrice noticed Hero and her maid Ursula seated on the edge of a fountain that was ringed by statues on pedestals. Beatrice went to join them, but ducked behind the nearest statue when Ursula shrieked, "Look!" "Don Pedro told me so," said Hero. "He asked me to mention it to Beatrice, but I refused. She'll never return Benedict's love." "Why ever not?" Ursula exclaimed. "He's a handsome enough fellow." "Beatrice is too cold and proud to surrender herself to any man," said Hero. "If she knew about Benedict, she would make a laughing stock of him, no matter how sick with love he is." "True," Ursula agreed. "Better from love than from the lashing of Lady Beatrice's tongue." Beatrice's eyes bulged. Cold? Proud? Me? She thought. I'll show them how wrong they are. I'll save Benedict's life by loving him. Don't die yet, dearest Benedict. She'd never thought of Benedict as dearest before. Late that night, Dom Pedro answered a knock on his door and found himself facing his half-brother. "What is it?" asked Dom Pedro. "Wake your friend Claudio," Don John said. "I have something to show him." "At this hour?" Don John nodded. "If I told him, he wouldn't believe me, and nor would you," he said grimly. "You must see this for yourselves." On the morning of the wedding, all Leonato's servants gathered outside the family chapel. Hero looked radiant in her wedding gown. Claudio and Dom Pedro seemed uneasy in their smart uniforms. Benedict and Beatrice kept glancing at each other and smiling. The family priest, Friar Francis, raised his hands for quiet. "Friends," he said, "if anyone knows of a reason why this man and this woman should not be married, then Claudio interrupted. He pointed at Hero. "She is dishonorable. I saw her embracing another man." "You are," shouted Leonato. "No mistake, old friend," said Dom Pedro. "I saw her too. She was on her balcony kissing Borracho, Don John's servant. Claudia and I can no longer stay in this house." Without a sound, Hero fainted and collapsed in her father's arms. Beatrice and Benedict hastened to assist her, while uproar broke out among the servants. Dom Pedro and Claudio marched in step through the clamour. Leonato's eyes were dazed. "Can it be true?" he muttered. "No, innocent," cried Beatrice. "Of course she is," said Benedict. "This is some trick of Don John's to spite the prince's friend." Friar Francis crouched down and spoke quietly to Leonato. "Sir, take my advice. Have your daughter carried to her room and announce that she is dead. Claudio will pity her, and pity will rouse loving memories in him. After a few weeks, when she's restored to him—" "Claudio doesn't deserve her," snarled Beatrice. "He should be Overcome with emotion, she scampered into the chapel with Benedict close behind. Beatrice stood before the altar, tears running down her face. "If I were a man, I would make Claudio suffer for what he has done," she declared. "I love you more than all the world, Beatrice. I can't bear seeing you so upset," said Benedict. "I would do anything to comfort you." Beatrice glared at him through her tears. "Then go to Claudio, and challenge him to a duel," she said fiercely. Don Pedro and Claudio were collecting their horses from the stables when Benedict found them. He ignored their greetings and seized Claudio by the throat and slammed him against the stable door. "Hero is dead! Your accusations have cost an innocent lady's life. Name a time and place, and I'll fight you with whatever weapons you choose." He released Claudio, who stared in bewilderment at Don Pedro. "Hero? Dead?" he whispered. Cursing voices made the three men turn their heads. Borracho, with his hands tied behind his back, was being led up to the governor's house by a local constable. "What's this, constable?" asked Don Pedro. "I arrested this villain at an inn, my lord," the constable answered. "He was drunk and bragging about deceiving you and Lord Claudio." Borracho hung his head. "The woman you saw me with last night was Margaret, Lady Hero's chambermaid, dressed in some of her mistress's old clothes," he admitted. "Don John paid me to do it." "What?" demanded Don Pedro. "He left at daybreak," Borracho said. "I don't know where he was bound," vowed Don Pedro. Claudio sank to his knees and covered his face with his hands. "Hero was innocent, and he sobbed. That night, a funeral service was held for Hero. Afterwards, Claudio and Leonato spoke. "How can I gain your forgiveness?" said Claudio. "Nothing will bring Hero back. But there's something you can do," Leonato said. "A poor relation of mine is anxious for his daughter to marry a nobleman. She's a lovely girl, very like my dear dead daughter. Will you take her as your wife?" Claudio, too close to tears to speak, simply nodded. And so it was that early next morning Claudio went once more to the chapel to be married. He was met by Leonato, Don Pedro, Friar Francis, and Benedict and Beatrice, who were arm in arm. "Where is my bride?" asked Claudio. Hero emerged from the chapel. "Here," she said. Don Pedro drew a sharp breath. "Can this be the same Hero who was dead?" he wondered aloud. "She was only dead for as long as her innocence was in doubt, my lord," said Leonato. Claudio's eyes glowed with love and wonder. "Hero!" he gasped. "Take better care of her this time, Claudio, or I'll have to challenge you again," warned Benedict. He turned to the friar. "Is there room for another couple in your chapel? I asked Beatrice to marry me last night, and she amazed me by saying yes." Don Pedro laughed. "Shall I set you up as an archery target, Benedict?" he teased. "I'm already a target, my lord," said Benedict, grinning broadly. "And all the arrows that struck me have been fired by Cupid." And that is the end of the story. I think you can see the meaning there. I think we've got a very good example of it going on at the moment, when somebody is being punished as though they are guilty before they've even been proved innocent. And it's the wrong way round. One should be innocent and then have to be proved to be guilty. Hope you enjoyed that one. I'll see you again next week, boys and girls. Have a good week. Bye.